here we go. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to kick off today's Bolin Weekend Alumni Keynote Address. My name is Shui Wang, class of 96. I'm a member of the steering committee of the Williams Asian and Asian American Alumni Network, called WAN with 4 A's. Through online monthly social gatherings called WAN Connects, holiday celebrations such as our annual Lunar New Year talk this year with class of 97 filmmaker Val Wong, a Moon Festival trivia in connection with the astronomy department, mentorship sessions covering various careers, and even book club discussions. WAN is a resource for support, advice, and contacts to Asian and Asian American alumni, students, and the college. We welcome participation from the entire Williams community at all our events. Now to my public service announcement. As Bolin Legacy 2222 comes to a conclusion, we'd like to thank all of our panelists, moderators, and attendees for participating and continuing the tradition of support and mentorship of Gaius C. Bolin during this 4th biennial Bolin Legacy Mentorship Weekend. We'd like to remind you that this event is being recorded. We also invite you to use the chat to engage with attendees and the Q&A function to ask any questions you may have for our panelists as the conversation goes along. We're turning things over now to Jackie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Milian. I'm class of 2013, and I am proud to represent the Williams Latinx Alumni Network, or WLAN, which promotes the voices of Latinx community of Williams College by creating agency through access and advocacy. Now, before we begin, we respectfully acknowledge that this event is coming to you from Williams College, which stands on the ancestral homelands of the Stuckbridge Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continue as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Thank you. We'd also like to remind you that this event, as all Bolin events, will center on the experiences of students and alumni of color. We ask that all attendees be mindful of impact and respect these spaces and what is shared. And now over to you, Rob.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Michel, class of 2003, former and interim acting co-chair of Williams College Black Alumni Network. In the 22-23 academic year, Williams College Black Alumni Network will celebrate 40 years of kinship and culture building. We've spent nearly half a century establishing meaningful connections between Black alumni and students. With the goal of reflecting upon and leveraging our shared and unique experiences, WeBank continues to support and challenge the college's work with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion, work to improve the experience of current students, and create opportunities for our ever-growing community of alumni. As we reflect on the legacy of Gaius Bolin this weekend, our alma mater's first Black graduate, the snowshoe prints he left on our campus as a roadmap for all to follow, we must acknowledge the fact that mentorship and support needs amongst our communities of color will always shift and evolve, as will we in response. Please help us shape future Bolin weekends by responding to the feedback form that will be shared in the following week. Now, I'm thrilled to introduce a woman who has shepherded our institution through some of the most challenging times in recent history, President of Williams College, Maud Mendel. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, President Mendel.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's so great to be here. And thank you all for being part of the 2022 Bolin Legacy Mentorship Weekend, the 4th biennial celebration of its kind. This year also marks 137 years since Gaius Charles Bolin Sr. matriculated at Williams, becoming the first Black graduate of the college and the first in his family to attend college. In his honor, and following a tradition created by the Williams Black Alumni Network, the Bolin Legacy Mentorship Weekend seeks to strengthen intersectional connections from alumni to alumni and alumni to students, to nurture relationships between alumni of color and the college, and to evolve campus partnerships in support of mentor-mentee bonds. Gaius Charles Bolin Sr. opened doors to those who were historically unable to access the institution and exemplified what it means to be a Williams alum in his dedication to his community and his family. And it really is an honor to not only continue recognizing his legacy, but also to share with you how it continues to be preserved. Bolin spent his life working toward racial and social justice, and he valued support, mentorship, and advocacy. And these really are values that we continue to drive the missions of our Alumni of Color networks at Williams. And so it gives me great pleasure today to thank the leaders and members of these networks here who are with us. And that includes the Williams Black Alumni Network, which is gearing up for its 40th anniversary this fall, which is so fantastic. The Williams Asian and Asian American Alumni Networks and the Williams Latinx Alumni Network, which are both celebrating 30 years in 2023. And let me also recognize and celebrate the work of members of our bisexual, gay, lesbian, and transgender alumni network and the Williams First Alumni Network. These are all sustaining spaces for our students and alumni of color across sexual orientation, gender, and college generational status. And really, the college would not be where it is today without your voices, your commitment, your care, and your time. And I'm really grateful to all of you for participating and for staying committed to and engaged with Williams College. I thought I might just take a couple of minutes to tell those assembled here about some of the commitments of the college in recent years that foster some of the goals around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, which are one of the key cross-cutting commitments in our upcoming strategic plan, and that spans really all the departments and programs of the college. And there are many things going on, including numerous opportunities to expand racial justice and increase our understanding of institutional history commitments, including some areas that are specifically addressed in the plan. Part of it includes the new partnership with the Stockbridge-Muncie Mohican Nation, which now has an office for its historic preservation office on Spring Street, with quite a number of Williams students that have funded internships to work with them on various projects around all kinds of historical and archaeological work that office is doing. We've also done significant work in other arenas, expanding fellowships and internships and related opportunities for students to learn alongside racial justice advocates and promote racial justice initiatives. And some of these internships in particular, as well as our other racial justice efforts, are projects in Williamstown and throughout our region, as well as nationally, through the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Davis Center, our Center for Learning and Action, where students really take this work into the schools, prisons, old age homes, and throughout the region in supporting racial justice work. We also seek actively to recruit and retain staff and faculty of color with expertise in racial justice and related issues. And we are embedding racial justice questions into the curricular and co-curricular offerings, including the steady development towards an Asian American Studies program, which the faculty are in a process of developing over these years that I've been at Williams, and as we've been increasing the number of faculty in that program. I'm happy to announce that we've just hired the second and two of the approved lines in that search this spring, and that will allow us to move forward with the building of a program. I think it's also really important to note, as we continue to work on these initiatives, and there are many more that I could talk about as well, that this is ongoing work that's never done. And it's worth acknowledging that there were a number of students this semester who spoke at a recent Black Town Hall, making it very clear that there's plenty of work that Williams still has to do in order to make the campus and the town a truly inclusive space. And so this is work we seek to do and we're committed to doing, but that is also continuously ongoing. And I'm deeply committed to working with these students who, in fact, I'm hoping I am going to be seeing on Monday to continue the conversation and to see if we can do more to support those on campus who feel that their experiences here require increased support. So this work has really been a top priority of mine since getting here, and some of it has been embodied pretty specifically in the Davis Center initiative, which we launched early on in my time here. And it's through this project, we seek to build on the history and community that alumni have built here over generations, and acknowledge that many on this call have deep personal connections to these spaces. So the Davis Center project is in part a building project. It will be located in the same location as the current Davis Center building, which is next to our Science Center. But what was very clear to me upon arriving early on and talking to the staff and students affiliated with the space was that the current facilities were not equipped for student groups' needs. So the new building will have proper gathering spaces, significantly upgraded and accessible kitchens, which came out all over and over in conversations as spaces that are useful to support student activities and feeling as if there's really supported areas for community building. There'll be study spaces and more. Demolition for this project will begin and the ground will be broken this summer for the construction project. The current staff are currently in a temporary space in Bascom House, which many alumni will know as the old admission building or an old co-op. And so the Davis Center is in motion and is living in that space for the year while we actually engage in the Davis Center renovation project. But we're simultaneously working to fundraise to programs at the Davis Center, including special events, co-curricular activities, academic pathways programs, all to support historically underrepresented students in this multicultural center that has provided a home away from home for so many students. In addition to the Davis Center initiative, I'm so proud to have announced a few weeks ago the college's decision to move to an all-grant financial aid program. The college's historic leadership and access and affordability is one of the major things that attracted me to Williams. And really, it was thrilling to announce the nation's first ever all-grant financial aid program. And just a word or two about why this was such a big deal. This new program makes Williams more affordable for all of our aided families in a way that really promotes student opportunity. It not only eliminates loans from our students' financial aid packages, which some other institutions had done in recent years. So we did that, but we went further by removing the requirement of campus and summer jobs from all of our financial aid packages. And we replaced both the loan portion of financial aid and the work study portion of financial aid with equivalent grant funds dollar for dollar. So I hope it's clear, listen to those of you listening, that the goal of this project is to eliminate the barriers for aided students to participate fully in campus life. As it happens, all students benefit from this change, aided or not, because it means that all students have the same curricular and co-curricular opportunities, which enrich the campus for everyone. And it supports our efforts to continue to diversify the student body and to make sure that Williams is a place where everybody and all can thrive. So this move was really the most recent step towards making Williams truly affordable for students and families by seeking to cover the hidden costs of attendance, which has been a commitment of the college over recent years as we move to a free textbook program and course material program, provided health insurance and funding for travel courses and internships, et cetera. So this new program is part of this larger college commitment to true affordability. And I'm quite excited at the opportunities it will provide for students to further engage when they would previously have felt required for the purposes of funding the Williams portion of their education to have a job. Other important things going on in the space of making Williams fully inclusive and noting the important history that's gotten here, which is that we come up on the 50th co-education milestone. So we've begun to recognize the 50th anniversary of the advent of co-education this year. And as we mark this moment, let me recognize the women of color who, like Bolin, continued to open doors and build opportunities for those who followed them. And you will hear over this next year and beyond more about this as we look forward to celebrating them for their leadership, their resilience, and their strength. I would also like to take a minute to recognize one remarkable pioneering woman who sadly passed away last fall, Paula Moore Tabor, class of 1976. And through her love and commitment to Williams and the Alumni Relations Department, Paula created with WeBand the first ever events celebrating the legacy of Bolin. One of the college's most beloved alumna pathbreakers, Paula left a multifold legacy of care, compassion, advocacy, and commitment to her alma mater, and all those who had the privilege to know her personally, be it for years or for special brief moments. So we name her today. We thank her once again for her love, her support, her mentorship. Thank you, Paula, for everything you've done and did for Williams. So where do we hope to go with alumni engagement? The Bolin Legacy Mentorship Weekend continues to be a celebration of how far we have come as a community and how the voices of our students and alumni of color have shaped and changed our Williams history for the better. Colleges like Williams have historically implemented necessary institutional advances in response to the demands made by students who recognize and point out social and structural inequities. If not for moments of activism like the Hopkins takeover in 1969 or the hunger strike in 1995, we would not be the better, stronger Williams we are today. With the bicentennial of the Society of Alumni behind us, we also look to the next 200 years and how much further we can go together. Alumni engagement is part of the college's strategic plan. One of my biggest surprises upon arriving at Williams was the depth of alumni engagement for this institution. And it's not, in fact, common to see in college strategic plans a commitment to alumni. But once I recognized this, I've increasingly called the special sauce of Williams, it's this alumni engagement. We really thought it was very important that we also think strategically about building on the strength of Williams' alumni engagement with the institution. So our goal is to make Williams a place where every student and faculty and staff member, but also every alum, no matter race or ethnicity, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, and citizenship, truly belong and feel as though they can be welcomed and thrive on this campus. So it's exciting to continue to build with you towards that goal in the coming years. And thank you for all you do to advance that goal and to support Williams and our students now and in the future. So now it is really a great honor to introduce tonight's speaker. In recognition of the power of advocacy and activism amongst our alumni of color and women of Williams, it's really a tremendous honor to introduce an educator and civil rights attorney, our 2022 Bolin Legacy Mentorship Weekend keynote speaker, Anita Earls, class of 1981. Before taking office as the Associate Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, she was a civil rights attorney litigating voting rights, police misconduct, and other civil rights cases for 30 years. Anita was the founder and executive director of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, a nonprofit legal advocacy organization in Durham, North Carolina. Appointed by President Clinton, Anita was a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division from 1998 to 2000. She served on the North Carolina State Board of Elections, the North Carolina Equal Access to Justice Commission, and currently co-chairs the Governor's Task Force on Racial Equity in Criminal Justice. As an educator, Anita has taught as an adjunct professor at UNC and University of Maryland Law Schools and in the African and African American Studies Department at Duke University. Let me also offer a big thank you to Assistant Professor of History, Tyron Stewart, for moderating the conversation with Anita after her address. So please join me in welcoming Justice Anita Earls. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, President Mandel, for that really kind introduction. And thank you for all the amazing things that you are doing at Williams. I am enormously grateful for the opportunity to address the topic that I want to talk about this evening, operationalizing diversity in the professional setting. And I also just want to thank the organizers of this event for including me and for all of you who are, it's a early Saturday evening, and you're here listening. So I hope that you will ask questions and we'll certainly be monitoring those, and I will try to get to all of them if possible. But I'm just grateful for this chance. And so why is this an issue for me now? I mean, I want to say part of the reason why I'm so glad to have the chance to talk about this and hopefully engage with you on this topic is because it actually is really salient for me in my current position as a justice on the North Carolina Supreme Court. And certainly, having been a civil rights attorney for 30 years, I was in plenty of professional settings. But what I've recognized since being on the bench is that my career up until this point, while I had plenty of interaction with all sorts of people, and litigation is very contentious and you have the folks on the other side, but I was always in settings where my colleagues shared, at least in some fashion, the ultimate goal of advancing civil rights. So whether I was at a nonprofit national litigating organization like the Lawyers Committee, whether I was at the U.S. Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division, a big institution with a lot of different views about how you advance civil rights, at least everyone shared that commitment. And now I am the only public interest lawyer on our court. And it's really been challenging for me to learn how to navigate this professional setting that is different from all the other ones I've had. And what I've recognized and what I've learned so far in my 3.5 years to date, it is the central theme of my talk. And that is my sense, the proposition I want to offer to all of you and get your feedback and insights, is that to be serious about realizing the values of diversity, as the diversifier, the person who's bringing a diverse voice to the table, you have to commit to be your authentic self, even when it doesn't fit, even when it causes discomfort. And that's a choice. You don't have to choose that. You don't have to do that. But that it's been an eye-opening experience for me. And in many ways, that is a lesson that I learned more generally when I first came to Williams back in 1977. That's the year I entered. And I want to start off by sharing with you something that was incredibly inspiring to me while I was at Williams. And it has something I've kept with me. And what it is a quote from a speaker who was brought to campus back then. It was Bernice Johnson Reagan, who headed the group, the a cappella gospel music group, Sweet Honey in the Rock. When she was younger, was very active in the civil rights movement as a high school student. She was in the South protesting, getting arrested to advance civil rights, and enormously influential to me. She came to campus, and I found, after she was there, an interview. And I actually wrote out what I'm going to read to you now on this yellow piece of paper, and I put it on my wall in my dorm room because it was so inspiring to me. And so this is what she says. What I've had since the civil rights movement is a better knowledge of who I am in this society, an understanding of my power as a person to stand and speak and act on any issue that I feel applies to me in some way and therefore to other people. I learned that I do have a life to give for what I believe. Lots of people don't know that. They feel they don't have anything. When you understand that you do have a life, you do have a body, and you can put that on the line, it gives you a sense of power. So I was empowered by the civil rights movement. I'm seeing what happens when you're Black, when you're a woman, when you're outside of categories that are comfortable. There are just 100 different ways of clashing. Yet I somehow know that I have a right, almost a responsibility, to struggle to be all of those things. If I don't work out in my lifetime who I am and fight for that space, then I will never be. I will be somebody else's representation or the society's representation of what it will tolerate me to be. So I found her courage in being willing to stand up for what she believed in and put her life on the line to be so inspiring then, and I still find it to be a core truth today. So what does that mean for the U.S. Supreme Court? I want to first, before I talk about the significance of the fact that we now have an African-American woman about to be sworn in as a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. What's the context we have? And I'm only going to go back so far as 2016 because, and this is very much from a legal perspective, but in 2016, I remember very vividly in October of 2016, speaking to a group of legal aid attorneys and talking about the potential that if the election of 2016 were to result in a Democratic president, we might, for the very first time, have a Supreme Court a U.S. Supreme Court that ultimately would be a majority of people appointed by Democrats. And that had not happened since, I think, 1967. I mean, the record, I'm just talking now like the historical record. We have had a U.S. Supreme Court, the majority of whose members are appointed by Republicans, that long. And so for me, like, that's the entirety of my career, pretty much the entirety of my life. And it seemed like a watershed moment. And of course, that didn't happen, and we still do not have that. And we are beginning to see some of the incredible far-reaching consequences that's going to have for our civil rights. And just to put a footnote on consequences, when I was campaigning for this office in 2018, I talked a lot about what it meant to grow up in a mixed race family and how my parents moved from Missouri to Washington State so that they could legally get married because it was illegal for them to get married in Missouri, and how I was actually 7 when the U.S. Supreme Court decided Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court case that said that you had a constitutional right, that it was unconstitutional for states to make interracial marriages illegal. And so it's pretty stunning to me that the doctrines that led to that decision are now up for grabs and may be reversed. Which isn't to say I'm predicting that a lot of states will start passing laws banning interracial marriage, but it's still, to me as a civil rights attorney, enormously troubling. Following 2016, we saw a next historical point I want to emphasize as part of the context that we are in now. What is the summer of 2020 and George Floyd's murder and the demonstrations that broke out not only all around the country, but literally around the world. And I think when the history books are written and the numbers are counted up, there were more people demonstrating in more places around the country. And I think I counted something like 100 different cities and towns in North Carolina where there were demonstrations in the summer of 2020. It's really extraordinary. The reaction to that event and the calling, the demand, people during a pandemic willing to go out in their masks and demonstrate in support of the call for the need for racial equity and racial justice in this country. And where we are now in 2022, I would say, is in the midst of a full-scale backlash to those demonstrations. That I think the divisions in our country politically are only deepening along racial lines. And let me just give 2 examples of that. When I was running for office in 2018, it really struck me how what was considered on my opponent's side to be a negative thing to say about me was something my supporters were excited to say about me. So my opponent called me a social justice warrior, and my supporters also called me a social justice warrior and were really happy to support me because of it. So just, we're living in a politics where there's just no overlap. And more recently, another example of just the deep divisions, the fact that in February of this year, I found myself in the surreal position of the same week in February being in the news because the administration had me, along with many other incredibly talented Black women, on a short list for the U.S. Supreme Court, while at the same time, Republicans in my state, in North Carolina, were proposing to impeach me. So really different views about my qualifications and ability to be on the bench. But just to my mind, what that says more about our politics than it does about me. And we are just in an incredibly divisive time. And then the other observation I'll make about the context we're in is my sense, and this is purely my personal view, that the people who have the least to fear are the most afraid right now in our society. So when I say the people who have the least to fear, people who are financially secure, are in the majority, are racially in the majority currently, who are the most secure, have the biggest safety nets, who suffer the least from the things that threaten communities of color and low resource, low wealth communities. They seem to be the most afraid of sort of, you name it, fear has been whipped up. And so I don't know what to make of that phenomenon, but it seems part of the context that we then see ourselves with this incredible milestone, that we have the nomination and confirmation of soon-to-be Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. And so I start with, what does that mean for the court? And I think the first thing to note is that it means we've had a court that for all these years has not had that perspective on it. And what we should understand is that there's not going to be an immediate turnaround. They will hear, the other justices in their conferences will hear a perspective that they have not heard before. But there's like this overwhelming wall of precedent that's been built up without that perspective, and that within the institution of legal doctrine, change takes a long time. The other thing I wanted to note is what does diversity then mean in this setting? And I think it's really important to think carefully about the distinctions between descriptive representation and substantive representation. And I'm borrowing those terms from political science, but I think they apply in this setting as well. So descriptive representation, meaning that a salient feature, whether it's age, gender, race, socioeconomic background, disability, all sorts of different ways, sexual orientation, gender identity, all those things are descriptors. And you feel like you have representation when someone who shares your descriptive characteristics is represented. But more fundamentally for our court, I think, is the substantive representation. So descriptive representation is enormously important. And I am so excited about all of the young Black women, I think, who will be encouraged and feel that being a lawyer, being a judge is something they can do now when they see Ketanji Brown Jackson sworn in as a justice on the court. So descriptive representation is enormously important, has huge impacts and generational impacts, but it's only one feature. And the other I submit is substantive representation. And here in the legal context, I think that means having on an appellate bench people from a variety of different areas of practicing law. And so I think you've seen this administration focus on that. That is to say, we need public defenders as well as former DAs. We need people who've worked in business law, corporate law, as well as people who've worked in public interest law. People who, I would say, people who've been litigators their whole career, as well as people who've done transactional work, people who've been on the bench at lower courts, as well as people who haven't. That having those variety of perspectives is the best way ultimately to get at the truth, that no single perspective, whatever it may be, is the final answer or has all of the information that's necessary and useful. So I think that there's many ways in which Judge Brown Jackson's background brings a lot of that substantive diversity to the court as well. And then why does it matter? I talked a minute ago about how it matters for mentorship purposes and for inspiring younger folks, but there's a whole bunch of other reasons that it matters. And one piece of evidence I would submit for your consideration is a study that was done on the impact on juries of when the, so this was research in connection with whether or not Batson and the precedents that say we should have a racially diverse jury, how important those precedents are. Research about does it really change how jurors deliberate, and what the and I'm not going to, I don't have the study to quote in front of you, but I know the results. That jurors in their study, the juries not only discussed issues more broadly, but they actually remembered the facts more accurately. They discussed more of the legal issues when there were people of color on the jury. And in their study, it only took one, which was a little bit surprising to me. I thought, well, maybe there needs to be a little bit of a critical mass and that maybe we need 2 or 3 people of color on a 12-person jury. But it actually made a difference in the quality of their deliberations. And so I think that is relevant to an appellate court where you are not just a single judge making a decision, but you have a bench of some number of people discussing cases. So it, you know, the social science that backs this up. I think our personal experiences back this up, that diversity truly is really important. And so for our court, the fact that we will now have the first woman of color, first African-American woman, will ultimately make a difference, but that we have a long road ahead of us. But I want to flip the perspective for a minute and just ask, what does it mean for her in the professional? How will she operationalize this diversity in a professional setting? And part of the reason why I think I can address this it is because of the story that she told during her confirmation hearings, which was referenced a little bit in the description for this session. But she talked about her experience coming from Maryland, going to Harvard as an undergraduate, and just feeling that, you know, she didn't belong. How was she going to make it there? And finding such inspiration and encouragement from a brief interaction with a Black woman who passed her on the sidewalk and told her to persevere. And that says to me that she brought a diversity to that Harvard campus, and that she recognizes the challenges of coming to a professional setting, coming to an institution where you are underrepresented and have not always been at the table or been participating. And so what are some of the things that she's going to have to face? And I think the one of the key things, and so I'm just actually talking about my own school. What have I faced? Thinking that she might face the same things, because that whole feeling of not belonging and not understanding or not having doubts about whether or not you can make it in the situation is certainly something that I experienced. It resonated with me. I totally understood what she was talking about. I was the first in my family to have the opportunity to go to a 4-year institution. And the reason for that was both racial and economic. But my father, who was born in 1916, he lived to be 92, but he was born in 1916. And when he graduated from the segregated high school that he went to in Missouri, there were no 4-year institutions that would admit Black people. There just wasn't an option. He went to a 2-year institution called Stowe's Teachers College, and that was as far as he could go in his formal education. And so for my family, it was huge that I could go to Williams College. And my father came out very proudly to visit me on Parents' Weekend in my freshman year. It was a big deal. And so I think I understood, even though Judge Brown Jackson is younger than I am, I think I understand some of what she faced, and that what I've seen in my first few years on the bench is some of the unstated assumptions that I have to confront about matters that everyone else. It's sort of like the fish swimming in the water don't understand what oxygen is like. All of my colleagues are swimming in the water, and I've been out here breathing air, and they just have these unstated assumptions that don't ring true for me or my experience. And I think that that's what I have wrestled with is how do I convey that in a way that broadens their horizons, broadens their understandings, but is collaborative and isn't insulting to them. And that can, so these unstated assumptions about life and how the world works, I'm sure will confront her. I also have had the experience that I do what everyone else does, and it is criticized within my professional setting amongst my colleagues. And I can, a lot of what happens in our conferences is confidential, but I can talk about one public example. Earlier this year, our court issued a fairly controversial decision, a 4-3 decision, that on the issue of redistricting that required our legislature to redraw state legislative and congressional districts. The decision was time sensitive. There was enormous interest in it. And so the day that our order was issued that essentially stopped the elections process, required maps to be redrawn, once that decision was public, I used my Twitter account, which I almost never use, but I used it to send out a link to the opinion. And that was all I sent out. I sent out a 1-sentence summary of the holding, which was a quote from the opinion. And I linked the opinion. That's all I had. I gave no comment on it. I didn't say, great. I was in the majority, but I didn't say, hey, yay, us. I sent out the opinion because I was getting a lot of requests for it. And that seemed like the fastest, easiest way to share it. My colleague, the Chief Justice, in his dissent so we issued our order, and then there was a longer opinion. In the longer opinion, the first footnote to his dissenting opinion was highly critical of me, suggesting that this was improper and that I was inappropriately trying to celebrate some win that I shouldn't have been doing. And the thing to know is that many courts send out links to their opinions on Twitter. 2 of my colleagues, including the Chief Justice, but 2 of my Republican colleagues, I am Democrat, 2 of my Republican colleagues, send out links to their opinions on Twitter routinely. So I'm doing the same thing, and I'm being criticized. And that's that's probably the most public example I can give you. There's been other, well, I'll give you one other example. After that, during oral argument, and interestingly, there's actually a lot of academic research on the U.S. Supreme Court and how women justices get interrupted more often by people arguing in front of them. There's a lot of studies about women not, and especially with Black women not getting opportunities to argue in front of the court. But on our court, we had an argument in a case that was brought by the NAACP, and one of my Republican colleague, who during the oral argument asked a question that was incredibly insulting, and he asked to me personally. He said, "Well, Justice Earls said blah blah blah. Wouldn't it be malpractice for you not to make that argument?" So what I had said was something I'd filed in a brief when I was an advocate long before I came to the court, and almost everyone on our court was an advocate in some fashion for at least some brief part of their career. But the point being that this was a very, no one else on our court has been treated that way. Okay, so there's I expect that she may find that she will do what everyone else does, and she'll be criticized for it. I also expect that she will have to work twice as hard to be respected half as much. That is just still true in our professional world. But what I hope for her, and the bright light, is that she will have allies, and that she will be able to, she's already obviously been in legal settings and judicial settings before, and she will have allies. But my main point is, and what's been brought home powerfully to me is that it doesn't really matter sort of how far you advance in your career. I don't know, as a lawyer, a judge, as a litigator, I don't know how you can go any further than being on the U.S. Supreme Court. But the societal forces that have created the that continue to create and have reinforced the deep divisions that I talked about before, the professional world doesn't exist in a bubble outside of those. And so they are still present, and we have to do our best to figure out how to deal with them. And I want to just talk. I just want to share two more examples, not to be bleak and discouraging, but to be real. Two more examples of how it has been brought home powerfully to me that while I may have a seat at the table, there's ways in which I just don't belong, and I need to remember that in order to be ready for it. And so, because I've not always remembered that. So the first time, or the first and most dramatic time, came for me back in 2006. So this was after, in my career, I had. For 10 years, I litigated cases at a private firm. I was at the Lawyers Committee. I was at the U.S. Department of Justice. And in 2006, I was at the UNC Center for Civil Rights, working with my hero, Julius Chambers, the renowned civil rights attorney who argued just about every advance in civil rights laws in the 70s and 80s, and to some in the 90s. But I was in my office at UNC one day, and I got a call from my father, who was still living in Washington State. At this time, they had moved from Seattle to a rural area of Washington State, and he was distraught. He was really upset, and what concerned him, the problem, was that a neighbor had read in the newspaper that a Black man had been killed, and had brought that article over to my father to read. Because the man in the article was my brother. And as it turned out, he was murdered, and the police knew who did it, but they were unwilling to bring charges. And I went back to Washington State on a couple of occasions. I met with the police officers. I met with the district attorney and went over their files and tried to do everything I could to convince them that they should bring charges. And they gave me two reasons for why they wouldn't. The first was that this was a rural county, and murder prosecutions were very expensive, and the defendant had a good lawyer. Because my brother was killed by a woman who was arrested on the scene. But they wouldn't prosecute her. And the second reason they wouldn't prosecute her, given to me, was that in the district attorney's view, no jury in that county would convict a white woman for killing a Black man. And this was 2006. I was pretty devastated by the fact that I had worked for racial justice most of my career, and I was not going to be able to get justice for my family. So I pretty much almost decided to give up and find a new career. And ultimately, I really took the words of Nelson Mandela to heart. And he talks about how first he wanted to bring justice to his family, and then he wanted to bring justice to his village, and ultimately he wanted to bring justice to his country, that he realized that was actually his responsibility. And so, not that I could ever follow in the footsteps of such a great man, but I thought that if he could do that, I could at least try to do that too. And so I started a new organization called the Southern Coalition for Social Justice and ultimately decided to run for the court. But my point is just, I have maybe got too comfortable and I forgot that Black people still don't get a fair shake when they are the victims of crime. And that was a challenge. More recently, since being on the court, in fact, just 2 weeks ago, you should know for context. So our court is a 7-member court. We currently have 2 people of color. There's an African-American male who's also on the court with me. In the history, there's now 202-year history of our court. There have only ever been 7 African-Americans on the court, and we're all still living. Like, it's been that recent. There've been 9 women, but only 7 African-Americans. And that's out of a total of some 103 people who served on the court. So currently the court there are roughly 15, 16 young people who are employed as clerks at our court. And right now only 1 person of color, the African-American woman who is one of my clerks. Each justice gets 2 except for the chief, he has a few extra. So diversity on our court is a challenge. But my clerk was I took both my clerks to a professionalism dinner. And my clerk was having a nice conversation with another attendee. This dinner was attended by judges and lawyers. And this person said to my clerk during the course of this conversation, the other African-American justice is Justice Morgan. And they said, you know, I'm just so impressed by how well you and Justice Morgan speak English. My clerk, to her credit, kept a straight face and moved on in the conversation. Yes, this is a microaggression. They happen all the time, but it just was just so incredibly dispiriting to me that we are now in 2022. We went through all of the calls for racial equity and racial justice in 2020, and the backlash it's in full swing. People are opposing. So our task force on racial equity has recommended that all court system actors receive racial equity training. Our School of Government that trains judges developed an incredible curriculum to do this racial equity training. And our Administrative Office of the Courts has decreed that the Judges Conference will not get that training. They're not allowed to train on that. So we are fighting battles here, and I think they're important battles. I think that the importance, to my mind, of a democracy being a place where all voices can be heard, it is the only way to get to the best decisions, and that's what I'm fundamentally committed to. So I hope that that the exciting thing to be able to talk with all of you is you really are the hope for the future. You are the light that will bring us out of this darkness. I firmly believe that 10, 15, 20 years from now, things will not be as grim as they feel right now. And I am just excited to see all the things that all of you accomplish as you continue your challenges with operationalizing diversity and making a difference. So I'm going to stop there and open up. I don't see any questions right now, but I welcome your questions.
Anita, thank you for your incredibly insightful and sobering talk. I was especially moved by the last aspect of your talk, the sort of denial of justice you and your family experienced in 2006. I think so often we kind of conceive of racial injustice at a distance from us, whether that is personally or temporally. And yet these injustices are remnants, are not simply remnants of the past or something that we are immune from encountering in our daily lives. They kind of meet us at the door, and they're certainly all around us. So I'm delighted for the opportunity to be in conversation with you about some of these issues. I also look forward to having our audience join in later in the Q&A, as I know many will want to hear your insights on a myriad of topics. So I want to begin by kind of getting a sense of your relationship to Williams College. You mentioned being inspired by Bernice Johnson Reagan while at Williams. But as someone who grew up in Seattle, what led you to Williams and what were your experiences at the college like?
Right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your contribution to Williams in the things that you're teaching and all that you're giving students. I didn't know about Williams College until I didn't know anyone who went there, but I applied to all schools out of state, because when I was you have to put your mind back to 1976. This was before Microsoft. This was before Starbucks. Like, Seattle was kind of a place that people didn't really know what went on there. And I had only ever lived there, and it felt like going away to college was my only opportunity to see the world. I had been up to Canada once or twice, but I really had not traveled, and so I applied to 5 different schools, all of them out of state. And 2 things drew me to Williams, in addition to the mountains, because we have big mountains in Seattle, but you have, I can see you might call them mountains in the Berkshires. And the 2 things were the opportunity to study in a setting where I would have access to professors, right? The fact that it was a small liberal arts college with that kind of opportunity. And then without a doubt, the financial aid package that Williams gave me. And the way that opened doors that my parents really couldn't afford to send me really anywhere. And I took out loans, but Williams was very generous. And I worked in the dining halls and all those good things as a financial aid student. But the fact that it was financially possible was the other thing that brought me out to Williams. So you got to imagine that this is before the internet, right? So it's not like my parents could Skype with me when they wanted to see how long distance phone calls are really expensive. I flew out by myself. Everything I brought to college was in my 2 suitcases. And I considered myself incredibly lucky to have this amazing opportunity.
Really wonderful, and especially in thinking about the financial aid package, which has only gotten better, especially as President Mandel alluded to earlier. So since you alluded to your upbringing in Seattle, and you also mentioned my courses, so I teach a course here called North of Jim Crow, South of Freedom, where in essence we explore racial politics outside the American South, and particularly in the North, where discriminatory racial practices persist, but they're not underpinned by law, right? So there are invisible racial boundaries. And I was, kind of interested when I learned that your family crossed one of those boundaries by integrating a previously all-white neighborhood in Seattle. So can you discuss what your experiences were like, or what you remember of those experiences, and just the kind of racial atmosphere that existed in a place like Seattle?
Right. So it is true that even though, legally my parents could marry, that didn't mean that socially it was acceptable. We were isolated when we moved. So we lived in a Black neighborhood first. And then I think I was probably about 8 when we moved to an all-white neighborhood. My parents moved there because the schools were better. And education was key for both of them. And they wanted me to have the best educational opportunities possible. So to guarantee I could go to a really good elementary school, we moved to a white neighborhood. And our neighbors, one of our neighbors turned her hose on us, our garden hose on us, when we tried to ride our bikes up and down the sidewalk. there were numerous ways that they let us know that we were not welcome there. But that certainly isn't quite the level of violence that might have happened if they had been elsewhere. But Seattle, like many other cities, had challenges with, and the interesting thing about Seattle is that at the time was that, so the Black population was maybe 8% or 9%, something like that. But there's also a large Asian population and a very diverse Asian population. So, Japanese and Chinese and Korean and Vietnamese, a large, some, not large, but a Native American population as well. So the racial diversity, and now I think, it wasn't so true when I was growing up, but now I think there's also a larger Latinx community. So it's, in some ways, it was an incredible opportunity in that era, right? So this is like, 60, I grew up, from 60 to 77, to see kind of the blossoming of efforts to integrate and diversify a city. But there are plenty of racial barriers that my family faced, that I faced individually, and this, I will say one of the encouraging things for me now is that it's not so unusual to be mixed race. I mean, back then it was just really like everywhere we went as a family, we got stares, right? And there are places we weren't welcome to go to. And now it's just not as unusual. And I think the other thing I'll say is that while I wish I could say we're just on this slow trajectory towards justice and equality, I think we face some setbacks. And I think that there are places now that are just as hostile to Black people as they were in the 1960s, sadly.
I certainly agree. And it's always interesting because when I'm teaching, my students are always struck by the sort of hostilities that Black people face outside of the American South. There's this kind of assumption that once you engage in a great migration, you get away from the sort of pernicious developments happening in the South, that you come into a space where there's acceptance, tolerance, and that's simply not true. And this is also an era, just for our own historical edification, of open enrollments and neighborhood schools where housing really matters. So the fact that your family was willing to make that sort of daring move to put you in a position to have a more adequate education is certainly remarkable. So during your talk, just transitioning a little bit, you discussed Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court and what it will mean for how we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you highlighted the need for substantive representation. And I am thinking about this in the context of pioneering. So you also were shortlisted to be the first Black woman appointed to the Supreme Court, which is an incredible honor. Often, so much of the emphasis is on being a Black person. We tend to ascribe political significance to racial pioneers. But I think the goal is to create a legacy. And in reality, many of us are now the seconds, the thirds, and so on and so forth. So what are the challenges for us? What responsibilities do we have to continue the commitment to justice and progress in substantive ways? And how do we reconcile that enormous burden of representation in spaces where occasionally we might have colleagues who misread our aims and motives?
Right. Well, great question. But the first thing I want to note is that it is a choice to try to enter these institutions, and I would argue you don't that's not the only path. You don't have to, right? In other words, I highly value folks who have decided essentially their time, effort, energy, wisdom, experience, they want to devote all of that to creating safe spaces for their community, however they define it. So I love that. And I don't want to convey in any way the notion that being a pioneer is necessarily anything you have to do. And I knew, I will say, I did know that when I was leaving the public interest world, if you will, and going to an institution like the court, that it would be different, and that I would have it's a challenge. Let's be clear. I ran a nonprofit organization as a Black woman and with a diverse staff, and there's all sorts of leadership challenges to make that a safe space for everyone. And as an organization, we were committed to doing criminal justice reform while employing directly impacted people. How do you, there were just a lot of challenges. So there's nothing easy about creating a safe space. But if you find yourself in a professional setting, in an institution that doesn't share your values in a lot of ways, made up of people who with vastly different experiences. So I just think it's not enough. I think it's not enough to just be, whether you're the first or the 15th, it's not enough to just be the diverse person. I think that you take on, and I've really wrestled with this, but I think I took on at least the task of being my true self. And so that means speaking up. When these unstated assumptions about how the world works are bandied about, I feel the need to speak up and share my experiences. So let me give an example. In a case discussion about 2 Black women who were removed from a jury and whether or not this was racial discrimination in all the circumstances that led to them being removed from the jury, the prosecutor gave the explanation that he removed them from the jury, both of them, both these Black women, because of their body language. And I felt the need to explain to my colleagues that that was not a race neutral explanation. And I felt, and they did, that was beyond their experience. They thought, well, that's race neutral. That's just body language. He sensed from them a negative body language. And I'm like, wait a minute. That is not a race. And I'm telling you things that are in a written opinion that I've written. So this is not secret. But I have been in professional settings as a Black woman where I've been criticized for my body language. So, that is what I mean by being willing to be your true, authentic self, even when it's not comfortable. And then you have to bring in all the things of, you have to pick your battles, you have to be strategic. And there's a lot of skill set that people have developed over time that you can bring to bear on it. But that is my contention, that if you are going to be what I'm calling a diversifier, it's just not enough to be present. You have to be yourself.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree. It's interesting that you bring up race neutrality. Part of that course that I alluded to earlier, one of the things we kind of grapple with is race neutrality and thinking about its relationship to race liberalism and the sort of limits of it. And then the other thing you made mention of is the fact that you can't just be the diverse person. And in my own research, I study pioneering. And what's interesting is a lot of pioneers tend to be reluctant heroes, right? That is to say, we give political significance simply because they break barriers, but it's more than breaking barriers. As you pointed out, you have to kind of act in very substantive ways. So earlier this year, you gave the keynote address at the 62nd anniversary of Greensboro sit-ins, honoring the North Carolina A&T students who engaged in nonviolent sit-ins at Woolworth department stores. And I guess what I would like to know is, can you talk about what those sit-ins meant for you? It's interesting, those sit-ins occurred the same year that you were born. So how did it shape your understandings of democracy and of justice? And how did it motivate your own involvement in student activism exactly 40 years ago here at Williams, where you protested against South African apartheid?
Yes, well, thanks for that question. I did not learn about the Greensboro sit-ins until I got to Williams College and took a course that then Professor Charles Payne, well, there were enough of us students who were interested in learning about the civil rights movement that he taught us. It wasn't a course for credit. He spent time with us, letting us learn, and I can't remember what scheduling reason meant I couldn't take an official course. But anyway, it was not, I remember very well. It wasn't an official course, but we were reading about the civil rights movement. And that's where I learned about Bernice Johnson Reagan and Bob Moses and all the incredible things that I didn't learn in high school about the civil rights movement. And so when I learned that students were sparking a movement, I was like, okay, I'm ready. and what the passage I read initially about, your power, you can put your body on the line, wisely or not, I took that to heart, and I did do a hunger strike and sat in at the administration building because I also felt a tie to the events in South Africa and South African apartheid. And the reason for that is because I did learn about apartheid when I was, I think, junior high. I remember writing like a research report on apartheid. And what intrigued me about it was the fact that people like me, mixed race people in South Africa, had their own category. They were colored, right? And in the US, we didn't really quite have that. So I thought, well, gosh, as a really young, young girl, really young girl, I thought, well, maybe that's where I belong. Maybe those are my people because they're colored. And of course, I got a little bit older and figured out no, but it left me with a real sense of affinity to the struggle for freedom in South Africa. And the other amazing thing that happened during that sit-in, which my recollection is that our hunger strike lasted maybe 3 days. The administration didn't call the police on us. We sat in, I slept overnight on the ground floor at Hopkins Hall. But during the time that I was doing the hunger strike, the poet June Jordan, who's deceased now, but the poet June Jordan was on campus reading from her poetry. And she was another one of those heroes of mine. And I was so disappointed that I could not see her. And I think it was Professor Charles Payne, but someone told her that, well, there's actually a couple of students on a hunger strike right now. She came to Hopkins Hall and met us. And after that, she wrote me this amazing, beautiful letter saying how she was inspired by our courage and by us standing up. And that has just stuck with me all these years. And so while our student protest only resulted in the college agreeing to stop in placing its money in banks that did business with South Africa, they did not divest from Newmont Mining Company and other companies that we wanted them to divest from. It was a compromise. And so we started eating again. And for me, it was an important opportunity to say that my voice can matter and that, I can stand up and speak and act on things that I think are important.
Yeah, no question about it. It's interesting because I read an article about that protest written by one of my students. It was written back in February this year, Lucy Walker. And I believe there's an image of you at the protest captured in that article. So it was sort of fascinating to kind of see. So you mentioned the sort of ways in which you've been inspired by student protests. And of course, you alluded to by Moses, again, Bernice Reagan. And I'm always struck by the role students played in the civil rights movement. So, I'm thinking about SNCC. I'm thinking about the Nashville student movement, which kind of morphs into freedom riders. I think about even the Greensboro sit-ins. And in November of last year, students here at Williams protested for public divestment from fossil fuels. And more recently, there was a town hall in April organized by Black students on campus who continue to feel marginalized. So what is this to you, the centrality or importance of student activism today? And how critical is it for students to engage in both formal and informal public service?
Interesting. So I think that young people have a lot to teach us. And so, so part of my, so one thing that I think was very clear from the student sit-ins in Greensboro in 1960 was that they made it, there was the unwritten code that you couldn't sit down at the lunch counter if you were Black. By them doing that day after day, and understand this was not just a one-time event, it went on over months, and there were literally like hundreds of people who actually ended up going and sitting in. But they made that injustice visible, and they made it impossible to continue ignoring. And I think that young people, wherever they find themselves, students or otherwise, not only see things that adults have becomes the norm, becomes the water that the fish are swimming in. They see those things and have incredibly creative and powerful ways to make them visible, and that is really, really the first step towards addressing them. As long as it stays invisible, it's hard to even make the case that there's a problem or anything wrong. But beyond that, I think that there's a sense in which young people and students, they have the most to lose. They're going to be around the longest, right? It is their future. It is their world that is most impacted. And I think that we see, particularly, there's a number of movements since then where young people have played such a pivotal role and can illustrate the challenges. So I'm thinking, for example, of in 2013, the North Carolina legislature passed what's been termed the monster vote suppression law. This is a law that ultimately the courts, the federal courts, the Fourth Circuit concluded was intentionally racially discriminatory. When that law was being debated, there were young people, young Black people in the gallery of the General Assembly of North Carolina with tape over their mouths, protesting the fact that that law was being considered and that their right to vote was being implicated. And I think that had a tremendously important impact. I could go, there's many multiples of examples, but I just think that young people have so much to teach us. They're not going to be comfortable when things are wrong, and it's really valuable when they play a role in our public discourse, whether it's through protest or whether it's going to city council meetings, or whether however they can engage with decision makers on things that they care about. I think the more value we have.
That's really insightful. I think our students will certainly appreciate hearing that as they continue to engage in various forms of activism. So you kind of mentioned this in brief. You said invisibility, or you discussed invisibility. And I know in the recent past you have discussed the erosion of civil rights victories and how we are kind of returning to a legal system that for all intents and purposes reinforces private acts of discrimination. And you have stated the need to kind of identify injustices and to make them visible. So can you elaborate on what it means to you to make injustices visible?
Yes, well, I think there's been a lot of scholarship, legal scholarship, about the erosion of the civil rights gains that opened up doors from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, you pick the area of civil rights law, and I can tell you the cases that have eroded and diminished any opportunity to enforce those principles. We are definitely backsliding, and you can look at the affirmative action in higher education cases that are up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court now. That trend is continuing, and certainly what I've seen through both working at the Civil Rights Division, particularly now on the Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice, just getting data by race at a low enough disaggregated level to be able to describe how discrimination is going on is vitally important. And the efforts, I mean, just the fact that we can know that there is a movement to stop talking about critical race theory is indicative of the fact that there's a desire to deny the reality of what Black people in this country are experiencing. And I think there's another factor going on, which is the ways in which we are all in our own bubbles. So fundamentally, whether you look at media, social media, whether you look at, I think that the racial segregation, not only in our schools, but throughout all areas of our lives, is greater now than it has been in the past. And so that means that people can sort of live in their own bubble and not know or have to be concerned about what's happening to in the lives of people that aren't in their set. And I think you see this very forcefully, for example, the extent to which there's really extreme poverty in our communities, and it's hidden, right? And I think it didn't always used to be that way. I'm thinking, for example, of some of the studies of, actually the studies of racial residential segregation in the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, a southern city. When the city was first laid out, it was not racially segregated. Everyone had connection with somebody, like people knew about the lives of other people who weren't in their social set, who weren't in their economic set, who weren't in their racial set. They still knew about other folks' lives. I think that's no longer true. I think that, and understand, so Brian Stevenson talks about this a lot. He talks about how to ultimately end the death penalty in this country, we have to get to know the lives of people and like really hear them and listen to them that aren't white and affluent. And I see that. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And there's so many ways, like this is not just through the law. Like you can use culture. There are so many ways that you can illuminate, shine light on, make clear the injustices that people are experiencing, and that's an important first step to then getting in place ways to change it.
I have just one other question, and then we'll transition to the audience Q&A. I think about the problems that you are highlighting, that kind of backlash against the progress that has been made, whether it is thinking about movements to challenge racial injustice or even Roe v. Wade. And earlier, when you were giving your talk, you mentioned the vibrancy of the George Floyd protest and how it sparked, movements around the world, and yet we're seeing present-day recall, or it has sort of invited present-day recall or counterattack. We also see attacks on judicial activism, on critical race theory, which I find to be interesting, given your own assertion of, the sort of failures of legal doctrine to recognize fully how laws or policies can be discriminatory and how they impact groups of people. And so we're battling against all of these issues and this sort of backlash. My question for you really quickly is, what gives you hope amid the backlash that we are seeing occur?
Well, I think that in a lot of ways, one thing that gives me hope is the fact that we have a lot of knowledge and understanding of how, so I'm thinking of all the research on implicit racial bias as well as other implicit biases. I feel like we are way further down the road than we were 30 years ago about how racism operates, which can then help us be more strategic about how to combat it. And so just in the legal context, for example, the rest of the world finds disparate impact enough to show a legal violation. So if you can show that one race is experiencing, whether you're talking about health or education or job opportunities, if they are having disparate outcomes, that is a problem. And our law needs to embody that principle, I think, as well. So one thing that gives me hope is that there's a lot of understanding and knowledge and skills around how to address these issues. And I think the second thing that gives me hope, quite frankly, is I really believe that young people are much further along in abandoning the kinds of stereotypes and attitudes and racial animus that is fueling a lot of the current situation. So I believe that it is, darkest before the dawn, and that we're very close to the dawn of a new age led by young folks that recognizes and appreciates the value of diversity and ends a lot of the oppression that we're seeing right now.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much for that answer. And so we will now transition to the portion of the event where you can ask any questions you may have for Anita. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. And certainly we will do our best to answer them all with the time that remains. And so we have some questions already. So we have one from an audience member, I believe I'm pronouncing the name correctly. If not, I apologize. Kenma from Grand Valley State University. I used to live in Ann Arbor, so this is really wonderful. And her question is, how have you, I guess, worked to bridge the divide between the conservative and more liberal views of fellow North Carolina Supreme Court justices?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think that actually you also heard this come up a lot about Judge Brown Jackson, that she was a good consensus builder. I do want to some degree question the premise of the question, because in part, I see my role as sort of calling it as I see it, right? And whether that puts me further away from my colleagues or finding a middle ground, the important thing to me is to as best I can, assess how the law applies to a particular fact situation, and to ensure that we are doing everything we can to provide equal justice under the law and to give meaning to the Constitution and statutes that I am supposed to uphold. So that means that I don't see myself necessarily as a finding the middle ground. I mean, sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes middle ground is what we need. But other times I feel like a strong voice for what's right is what we need. And that right as in what is correct, what is just, what is fair, what is equitable. And that may not put me anywhere close to the middle. But I will say that the impact, so this is where, being like the only public interest lawyer, the only person who's made a career out of representing people who've been discriminated against, I shift the middle. So sometimes, an opinion isn't as bad as it would have been because I'm way over here giving my perspective. And I'm not making the case that my perspective is the only right one, correct one, but I am making the case that it's one that needs to be heard and needs to be factored into the mix.
Yes, and I think that kind of harkens back to that, to the argument you were making around substantive representation, right? Part of that is just not to be on the court, but to really help the court to rethink and reorder how it responds to these issues, how it issues judicial opinions, And I think there's balance that comes through pushing the court to really rethink its feelings or its opinions on various issues that we are confronting.
But I will say, let me answer that question in a slightly different way, though. There, I was just talking about substance, right? In terms of, I do also take very seriously the values of collegiality. And I tell myself all the time when I'm reading my dissenting opinions, my job is to say what I think about the law, not what I think about my colleagues. So I try always to be respectful of them, to listen to them, to not cut them off, to hear and understand what they're saying, which doesn't mean I feel the need to agree with them, but I do feel the need to be as respectful as possible, to draw out, if I don't understand why they're taking the position they're taking, to try to draw out so I can understand it. So in that sense, I hope that is a way to bridge the gap. I think it takes both sides doing that. So there can be an imbalance if one side's doing that, but the other isn't. But that, in that sense, I am very much trying to be bridging a gap and having respect for my colleagues.
No, I think that kind of collegiality is often uneven, but I think we have to remain committed to it in spite of. So we have a question from our own President Mandel, who says, can you say something about your thoughts on the leak related to Roe v. Wade and the protests around Roe v. Wade and how this moment might transform the Supreme Court?
Well, my sense is that it's actually not as unprecedented as it's been portrayed. And to me, the important, whether we learned about this decision in draft form now, or however it's ultimately final form in June or early July when it's finally released, actually won't matter that much. The significant thing is the willingness to overturn 50 years of precedent. And what I think about the protests are that people have that, I don't know about being at justices' homes, but for the most part, that is part of a democracy, that you are entitled to protest and talk with your feet, if you will, by going to the Supreme Court building and holding up signs and criticizing them. That is part of a democracy. And the interesting thing to me is that I know that Chief Justice Thomas has recently been quoted saying that, this is undermining the institution and people should just accept it. But from my perspective, what I see going on is that I think it is entirely legitimate for the public to take issue with the substance of what the court is saying. And, but what happens when, or at least certainly in my court, when we issued an opinion about redistricting that was unpopular for some folks, those folks were trying to undermine the legitimacy of our institution, and that's why they were talking about impeaching me. And that I think is a fundamental difference. And I think court reform is a perfectly legitimate topic for public debate. But when other folks were talking about impeaching me because they didn't like how I voted in a decision, that's what's actually undermining the legitimacy of our institutions. So I am very concerned about the direction of you might say, well, Plessy versus Ferguson deserved to be overturned. Yes, it did. And at the end of the day, it does come down to a judgment about what our Constitution should and should not protect. And I think that people on either side of the issue certainly have the right to protest about that.
No question. Well, I would certainly love the opportunity in the future for us to discuss court reform and certainly judicial activism. But we have reached the conclusion of this event and the 2022 Bolin Legacy Weekend. I want to certainly thank you, Justice Earls, for an incredibly wonderful talk and just the rich insight. I want to thank you all for being here, those in our audience. Thank you to our alumni network, President Mandel, and again to you, Justice Earls, for again your wonderful talk. Here's to a Bolin Legacy Weekend in 2024, and hopefully in 2024 we can all be together in person. Have a great rest of your Saturday. Thank you all so much. Enjoy your night.
Thank you.